A man who hadn't smiled in 6 years, a billionaire who believed she would never be loved again, and a cruel prank that was supposed to destroy them both. But instead, it sparked something no one saw coming. When her ex-husband dragged them into a vicious courtroom battle to tear them apart, one moment of raw fury changed everything. This is a story about what happens when two broken people stop waiting to be saved and start fighting for each other. If this story reaches you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The alarm went off at 4:15 in the morning, same as it always did, and Caleb Foster lay there for a few seconds staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been spreading since November. He kept meaning to fix it. He kept meaning to fix a lot of things. The faucet in the bathroom that dripped every 3 seconds like some kind of Chinese water torture. The back porch step that sagged when you put any weight on it. The crack running down the living room wall that Oliver once told his teacher was where the house is growing. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands and swung his legs off the mattress. The springs groaned underneath him. The fitted sheet had come loose on one corner again, bunched up in a knot he'd been sleeping on without noticing. He grabbed his phone off the floor. No nightstand. He'd sold it 2 years ago when the electricity bill came in $40 over, and checked the time. 4:17. 2 minutes wasted already. He moved through the dark hallway in his boxers and a t-shirt he'd worn 3 days running. The house was small enough that you could hear everything everywhere. The hum of the old refrigerator, the tick of the baseboard heater that never actually seemed to produce heat, and from behind the door at the end of the hall, the soft, whistling breaths of his son sleeping. Caleb paused outside Oliver's room. He didn't open the door. He just stood there, one hand flat against the wood, listening. This was the only good part of 4 in the morning, the only part that made the rest of it make sense. He went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker, which took a solid minute of coaxing because the power button stuck unless you pressed it at exactly the right angle. While it sputtered and hissed, he opened the fridge and stared at the contents like a man staring into a void. Half a carton of milk, some lunch meat that was probably 1 day past questionable, a jar of pickles. Oliver refused to eat, but also refused to let Caleb throw away because they live here now, Dad. He closed the fridge and leaned against the counter. 32 years old. He looked 40. He felt 50. And every single morning started exactly the same way, in the dark, alone, trying to figure out how to keep a 7-year-old kid fed, clothed, and believing that everything was going to be fine when Caleb himself hadn't believed that in years. He poured his coffee into the one mug that didn't have a chip in it, a faded blue thing Oliver had picked out at a yard sale because it had a cartoon dog on it, and sat down at the kitchen table. The chair wobbled. He'd stuck a folded piece of cardboard under one leg 6 months ago, and it kept sliding out. Outside the window, the street was dead. Their neighborhood sat on the edge of the city, a stretch of rented bungalows and duplexes that all looked tired in the same way. Peeling paint, patchy lawns, cars parked on the street because most of the driveways were cracked beyond use. It wasn't dangerous exactly, just forgotten. The kind of place where nobody was on their way up and most people had stopped pretending they were. Caleb had been here 4 years now, moved in right after Jenna left. He still couldn't say the word left without his jaw tightening, because left implied some kind of decision, some dramatic moment, a fight, or a goodbye, or at least a note. Jenna didn't leave. She evaporated. One Tuesday morning, she was there making toast and telling Oliver to stop putting crayons in the toaster, and by that night she was gone. No note. No text. No forwarding address. She just stopped existing in their lives, like someone had reached into the picture and peeled her out of it. He'd called everyone. Her mother, who said she hadn't heard from her and sounded like she meant it. Her sister, who hung up on him twice. Her friends, most of whom seemed confused that he was still around. He filed a missing person report. The cops looked into it for about a week and a half, then told him there was no evidence of foul play. She'd withdrawn money from an ATM in another state, and sometimes people just go. Sometimes people just go. That sentence had been sitting in his chest like a splinter for 6 years. Oliver had been barely a year old. Still in diapers, still waking up 3 times a night. Caleb remembered standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding a screaming baby in one arm and a bottle in the other, and looking at the empty side of the bed through the doorway and thinking, okay, so this is it then. No family to help. His own parents had died within 2 years of each other. His mother from cancer, his father from what the doctors called a heart attack, but Caleb always suspected was just giving up. No siblings. A handful of friends from high school who drifted away once kids and bills entered the equation. It was just him and Oliver. That was the whole team. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and got dressed in the bedroom. Work boots, jeans, a flannel shirt that still had drywall dust in the creases. His back ached from yesterday's pour. His hands were rough and cracked, the knuckles perpetually swollen. Construction wasn't a career he'd chosen. It was a net he'd fallen into after everything else collapsed. He'd been halfway through a business degree when Oliver was born. After Jenna disappeared, he'd dropped out and taken the first job that paid cash the same week. 6 years later, he was still there. Framing houses, pouring foundations, hauling material in the heat and the cold and the rain. His body was breaking down in all the ways you'd expect. Bad knee. Worse shoulder. A persistent ringing in his left ear from a nail gun incident 3 years back that he never got checked out because the insurance deductible was higher than the pain was bad. He checked on Oliver one more time before heading out. The boy was sprawled across the bed at an impossible angle, one leg hanging off the side, his stuffed Tyrannosaurus Rex, named Gerald, wedged under his chin. His dark hair stuck up in 6 different directions. He looked so much like Caleb it was almost funny. Same stubborn jaw. Same way of frowning even in his sleep, like he was working through some problem in his dreams. The neighbor, Mrs. DeLuca, would come over at 6:30 to get Oliver up, fed, and walk to the bus stop. She was 71 years old, watched game shows at a volume that could shatter glass, and charged Caleb $40 a week, which was $30 less than she should have been charging. She was the closest thing to a safety net he had. And every time she mentioned that her knees were getting worse or that her daughter in Tampa wanted her to come stay, Caleb felt a cold thread of panic stitch through his chest. He grabbed his lunch, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, packed the night before, and walked out the front door into the dark. The drive to the site took 22 minutes when there was no traffic, which at 4:45 in the morning, there wasn't. His truck was a 2004 Ford with a dent in the passenger door, a tape deck that hadn't worked since he bought it, and a check engine light that had been on so long he'd started thinking of it as a decorative feature. The construction site was a new housing development on the north end of the city. Big houses. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, 2-car garages, the kind of places that came with granite countertops and those kitchen islands that served no actual purpose except to give people a place to set their keys. Caleb had been building houses for other people for years now. There was a specific kind of pain in that. Knowing exactly how to frame a wall, wire an outlet, hang a door, and going home every night to a place where the toilet ran for 10 minutes after every flush. He parked and walked toward the staging area where the crew was already gathering. 6 guys, most of them around his age, most of them carrying the same hollowed-out look of men who'd been working with their hands since they were teenagers and would keep working with their hands until something in their body finally gave out for good. "Foster, you look like hell." That was Ray Maddox, the crew lead, a big red-headed guy with a voice like gravel in a blender. He was leaning against the tailgate of his truck, coffee in one hand, cigarette in the other. "Didn't sleep great," Caleb said. "You never sleep great." "Then why do you keep bringing it up?" Ray grinned. "Because one of these days you're going to say, 'Actually, Ray, I slept like a baby, and I want to be there for the historic moment.'" Caleb almost smiled. Almost. He grabbed his tool belt from the back of his truck and started strapping it on. The morning went the way mornings always went, framing on the second floor of Lot 14. Measure, cut, nail. Measure, cut, nail. The rhythm of it was the only thing Caleb liked about the job. When he was swinging a hammer, his brain went quiet. No bills, no loneliness. No wondering where Jenna was or what Oliver's teacher meant when she said he seemed withdrawn during group activities. Just the clean, simple math of wood and nails and making something stand up straight. By lunch, his shoulder was screaming. He sat on an overturned bucket near the portable toilet and ate his sandwich, watching the other guys cluster around Derek Haynes' truck, where somebody had brought a case of those energy drinks that tasted like liquid candy. Derek was 26, loud, and thought he was funnier than he actually was. He was the kind of guy who peaked in high school and spent the rest of his life trying to recreate that energy. He'd been on the crew about 8 months, and in that time, Caleb had learned to stay out of his orbit because nothing good ever came from it. "Yo, Foster," Derek called across the lot. "Come here, man. You gotta see this." Caleb took another bite of his sandwich and didn't move. "Seriously, bro, get over here." "I'm eating. It'll take 2 seconds." Against his better judgment, Caleb stood up, walked over, and looked at Derek's phone screen. It was a dating app, or something like a dating app, one of those platforms where you could message people directly. On the screen was a profile. A woman. Dark hair pulled back, sharp features, expensive-looking blouse. She wasn't smiling in her photo, but there was something in her expression, a steadiness, a challenge, that made you look twice. The name on the profile said Vanessa Whitmore. "You know who that is?" Derek asked, grinning. Caleb shook his head. "Dude, Vanessa Whitmore, the tech billionaire? She runs that company, what's it called? Prism Digital? They make all that AI stuff. She's worth like $2 billion. "Okay," Caleb said. "And?" "And she's on this app." "Good for her," Derek snorted. "Bro, I'm not just showing you. I messaged her." Something cold moved through Caleb's stomach. "What do you mean you messaged her?" "I mean, I sent her a message. From you." Caleb stared at him. "What?" The other guys were laughing now. Tommy Pruitt, a wiry guy with a neck tattoo, was bent over wheezing. Even Ray was smirking from the edge of the circle, though he had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable about it. "Relax," Derek said. "It's hilarious. I made a profile with your name and that photo of you from the 4th of July barbecue. You know, the one where you're holding the spatula and looking all serious, and I messaged her something about wanting to take her out for coffee." He held up the phone. "She hasn't responded yet, but delete it." "What?" "Delete it. Right now." Derek's grin faltered. "Come on, man. It's a joke. You think she's actually going to respond? She's a billionaire. She probably has people who screen her messages." "I don't care. You used my name, my face. Delete it." The laughter had stopped. The guys were looking back and forth between Caleb and Derek, reading the temperature. Derek shrugged, pocketing his phone. "Fine. I'll delete it later. Chill out." Caleb grabbed the phone out of his hand so fast that Derek flinched. Caleb looked at the screen. The message had already been sent. His name, his photo, a message that read, "Hey, gorgeous, saw your profile and thought I'd shoot my shot. Coffee sometime? I promise I'm not as boring as I look." He felt physically sick. "Give me back my phone," Derek said, his voice harder now. Caleb stared at the profile again. Vanessa Whitmore, 30 years old, CEO of Prism Digital. And then, underneath her bio, a small detail that Derek and the guys had apparently found even more hilarious. There was a photo further down her profile, wider angle, and in it she was sitting in a wheelchair. That was the punchline. That was why they'd done it. They hadn't picked a random billionaire to embarrass Caleb with. They'd picked a woman in a wheelchair because they thought it was funny. Send the broke single dad a message to the crippled rich lady and see what happens. Caleb looked up at Derek. "You're a piece of work." "It's a joke, Foster. You thought it was funny because she's in a wheelchair. I didn't say—" "You didn't have to." Caleb shoved the phone back into Derek's chest hard enough to make him stumble. Then he walked back to his bucket, sat down, and finished his sandwich while his hands shook. He didn't say another word for the rest of the shift. That night, after Oliver was in bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his own phone and did something he hadn't planned on doing. He searched for Vanessa Whitmore. The results filled his screen. Articles, profiles, interviews, she was everywhere. Forbes lists, tech conferences, magazine covers. She'd founded Prism Digital at 23 with a software platform that helped companies automate their internal operations. By 27, she was a billionaire. By 28, she'd been married to a man named Damian Whitmore, a venture capitalist who looked exactly like what you'd imagine a venture capitalist would look like. Square jaw, expensive haircut, the kind of smile that looked rehearsed. And then, at 29, the accident. A car crash. Details were sparse in the articles. A rainy night, an intersection, a truck that ran a red light. She'd survived, but with a spinal injury that left her in a wheelchair. 6 months after the accident, Damien filed for divorce. Caleb read that last part twice. 6 months. The man had waited 6 months after his wife was paralyzed and then walked away. He set his phone down and stared at the dark window above the sink. His reflection stared back. Tired eyes, 2-day stubble, a face that looked like it had been carved out of something hard and then left in the weather too long. He didn't know this woman. He had no reason to feel anything about her story beyond the same distant sympathy you feel when you read about anyone's misfortune in the news. But something about it stayed with him. Not the money, not the fame, the fact that somebody had promised to stay and then didn't. He knew that feeling. He knew it in his bones. Before he could talk himself out of it, he picked up his phone again, opened the app Derek had used, and found the message thread. The stupid message was sitting there, read but unanswered. Underneath it, he typed something new. Hi. This is going to sound strange, but I need to be honest with you. I didn't send that first message. A guy I work with created this profile as a prank using my name and photo. He thought it would be funny. It wasn't. I'm sorry you were part of someone's joke. You didn't deserve that. I'm going to delete this profile now, but I wanted you to know the truth first. Caleb Foster. He read it 3 times. Then he hit send and sat there in the quiet kitchen, feeling stupid and relieved in equal measure. He was about to delete the profile when a notification popped up. She'd responded. Most people who get caught in a prank just pretend it didn't happen. Why did you bother telling me the truth? He stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back. Because you're a real person, and what they did was disrespectful. Didn't feel right just disappearing without explaining. 3 dots appeared, then. That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me on this app, or anywhere actually, in about 2 years. He didn't know what to say to that. He typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be, I'm used to it. People are generally terrible. Not all of them. That sounds like something a person who hasn't been screwed over enough would say. Trust me, I've hit my quota. There was a pause. A long one. Then, you said this was a prank your coworker pulled. Why did he pick me specifically? Caleb closed his eyes. He could lie. He could dodge. He could say something vague about her being a public figure. But the whole reason he'd written to her in the first place was because he was tired of people being dishonest. I think because of the wheelchair, he typed. I think he thought it was funny to pair me, broke single dad from the wrong side of the city, with a woman in a wheelchair who happens to be worth more money than I'll see in 100 lifetimes. The whole thing was supposed to be a punchline. Another long pause, then, thank you for not lying about that. Didn't seem right. It wasn't, but most people would have. You'd be amazed how many people pretend the wheelchair doesn't exist and then act weird about it in every possible way. That sounds exhausting. It is. More than the chair itself, honestly. They talked for 2 more hours. He didn't know how it happened. It wasn't smooth or flirtatious or anything like the conversations he'd seen in movies. It was messy and choppy and full of awkward pauses where neither of them seemed to know what to say next. She told him she'd been on the app for 3 months and had received exactly 2 types of messages, men who fetishized the wheelchair and men who were clearly after her money. He told her he hadn't been on a date in 6 years and that his social life consisted of talking to a 7-year-old about dinosaurs and occasionally arguing with Mrs. DeLuca about whether the price on The Price is Right was actually right. She laughed at that. He could almost hear it through the screen. At midnight, she sent, I have to go. Early meetings. But Caleb? Yeah? Would you want to get coffee sometime? And before you say something self-deprecating, I'm asking because this is the first real conversation I've had with a stranger in longer than I want to admit. He sat there in his dark kitchen, the dripping faucet the only sound, and he thought about all the reasons to say no. He was tired. He was broke. He had nothing to offer a woman who literally ran a billion-dollar company. He was a mess, and he knew it, and she'd figure it out the second she met him in person. He typed, Yeah, I'd like that. Tata. They met on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop halfway between their 2 worlds, a place called the Paper Cup on Birch Street, wedged between a laundromat and a shoe repair shop that looked like it hadn't been open since the 90s. It was neutral ground, the kind of place where nobody would recognize Vanessa Whitmore, which she'd specifically asked for. Caleb got there 15 minutes early because he didn't know what else to do with his anxiety. He sat at a corner table, ordered a black coffee he couldn't really afford, and fidgeted with a sugar packet until it ripped and spilled across the table. He was sweeping the sugar into his hand when the door opened and she came in. She was smaller than he'd expected. Not physically, she was average height, or would have been standing, but there was something about seeing her in person that stripped away the larger-than-life quality of the articles and photos. She was just a woman in a wheelchair, wearing a dark jacket and no makeup, with circles under her eyes that her profile picture hadn't shown. She rolled up to the table and looked at him. He looked at her. "You're taller than your photo," she said. "You're more intimidating than yours." "Good. I was going for that." Neither of them smiled right away. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was more like two people sizing each other up and deciding whether the next hour was going to be worth the effort. Caleb stood up, then sat back down, then started to stand again. "You can just stay sitting," Vanessa said. "I'm already at the right height." He sat. "Sorry, I'm not good at this." "At what? Meeting people? Or meeting people who use wheelchairs?" "Meeting people in general. I haven't done this in a while." "Define a while." 6 years. Her eyebrows went up, not in a judgmental way, more like recognition. "That's a long time." "Yeah, how about you?" "Since the chair, nobody. Before that, I was married, so technically it's been even longer since I actually chose to sit across from someone." "How long were you married?" 14 months, which sounds short until you've lived through 14 months with someone who's already decided he's leaving but hasn't figured out how to say it yet. Caleb nodded slowly. "My wife didn't bother figuring out how to say it. She just left. Left like vanished. One day she was there, next day she wasn't. No note, no call, nothing, just gone." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "And your son?" "Oliver. He was barely 1 when it happened. He doesn't remember her." "Does he ask about her?" "Sometimes. He asked me last year where his mom was, and I told him she had to go somewhere far away. He asked if she took a plane. I said I didn't know. He said, 'I bet she took a plane because planes are faster.' And then he went back to drawing a picture of a stegosaurus." Something shifted in Vanessa's face. Not pity. Caleb had gotten very good at reading pity, and this wasn't it. It was something else. Understanding, maybe, or just the recognition of another person who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time without anyone to help hold it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why construction? You don't talk like someone who grew up swinging a hammer." "I didn't. I was 2 years into a business degree when everything fell apart. After Jenna left, I needed money that week. Not in 4 years when I finished school. A buddy knew a guy who was hiring day laborers. I showed up, worked hard, and never left." "Do you like it?" He considered the question. Most people didn't ask that. Most people assumed construction workers either loved working with their hands or hated their lives. Neither was really accurate. "I like that it's honest," he said. "I put in the work, something gets built. There's no pretending, no politics, no smiling at people you hate because you need something from them. It's just, here's the material, here's the plan, make it happen." That sounds nice, actually. It is until your back gives out at 40. My back gave out at 29, so I think I have you beat. There was a beat of silence. Then Caleb let out a sound that surprised him. A laugh. Short, rough, like his body had forgotten how to do it and was working out the mechanics in real time. Vanessa's mouth twitched. "Was that funny to you?" "It was terrible. I shouldn't have laughed." "No, you should have. That's the correct response. Trust me, the worst thing you can do when I make a joke about the chair is get that concerned face. I've seen that face 1,000 times and it makes me want to scream." "Noted. No concerned face." "No concerned face." They ordered more coffee, then they ordered muffins. Then they sat there for 3 hours while the coffee got cold and the muffins sat half-eaten, and they talked about everything and nothing in the way that only two people who've been lonely for too long can talk when they finally find someone who actually listens. She told him about the accident, not the clinical version. She said she was tired of the clinical version. She told him about waking up in the hospital, and the first thing she felt wasn't the pain in her spine or the fear that she couldn't move her legs. The first thing she felt was her husband's hand pulling away from hers. He was sitting next to the bed when she opened her eyes, and when she looked at him, she watched something die in his face in real time. Not love, exactly. More like the willingness to deal with what love was about to cost him. He tried, she said. I'll give him that. He tried for about 4 months. But trying looked like hiring nurses and physical therapists and buying a bigger apartment and solving the problem with money, which is all he knew how to do. What it didn't look like was sitting with me at 2 a.m. when I couldn't stop crying. What it didn't look like was learning how to help me into the shower without making me feel like a project. What it didn't look like was touching me the way he used to. Caleb listened without interrupting. He noticed she gripped the armrest of her wheelchair when she talked about Damien, not out of anger, but like she was steadying herself, bracing against something. He filed the papers 6 months after the accident, she said, on a Tuesday. His lawyer called my lawyer, very clean, very efficient, like a business transaction. What happened to him? Damien? He's still around, still in venture capital, still rich, still handsome, still the kind of man who walks into a room and everyone turns. We're in the same social circles, which means I see him at events sometimes. He always smiles at me from across the room like we're old friends. It makes my skin crawl. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. My wife didn't even leave me the dignity of a bad ending. She just erased herself. Sometimes I think that's worse, not having someone to be angry at, just having this blank space where a person used to be. Vanessa looked at him for a long time. You know what's strange? I've told that story about Damien to maybe 5 people. My therapist, my assistant, my lawyers, a couple of close friends who turned out to not be that close. Every single one of them responded with some version of, "You're better off without him." And maybe that's true. But not one of them ever just sat there and let me feel how much it hurt without trying to fix it. I'm not great at fixing things, Caleb said. I mean, I fix things for a living, but I'm talking about the other kind. Maybe that's why this works. He didn't ask what this was. It felt too fragile to name. They exchanged numbers, real ones, not through the app. Caleb walked her to the accessible van parked in front of the coffee shop and stood on the sidewalk while her driver helped her with the lift. She looked back at him through the window as they pulled away, and she did something he hadn't seen in her profile photos or her magazine covers or any of the polished images that existed of her in the world. She smiled. A real one. Crooked and uncertain and slightly embarrassed, like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't sure she was allowed to do anymore. Caleb stood on the sidewalk for a full minute after the van disappeared, his hands in his jacket pockets, the October wind pulling at his hair. Then he got in his truck, drove to Mrs. DeLuca's house to pick up Oliver, and spent the rest of the afternoon building a Lego spaceship on the living room floor while his son narrated an elaborate story about astronaut dinosaurs colonizing Mars. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the ache behind his ribs felt a little bit less like a permanent fixture and a little bit more like something that might, eventually, start to let go. The text started the next day. Vanessa sent the first one at 6 a.m, which surprised Caleb because he'd assumed billionaires didn't wake up before their assistants brought them coffee on a silver tray, or whatever billionaires did in the morning. The message said, I just spilled protein shake all over my laptop keyboard. If Prism Digital's stock drops today, you'll know why. He was standing in the kitchen packing Oliver's lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, a juice box, and 3 Oreos hidden under a napkin because Oliver believed secret cookies tasted better than regular ones. And he actually stopped what he was doing to read it twice. Then he typed back, At least you have a laptop to spill things on. My son put a peanut butter sandwich in our DVD player last week and I'm still finding chunks. You still have a DVD player? It came with the house, like the mice. You have mice? Had. Oliver named them before I could set traps. Hard to kill something your kid calls Mr. Whiskers and Diane. He named a mouse Diane? After his teacher. He said the mouse looked stressed and organized, like Mrs. Diane at school. She sent back a string of laughing emojis, which Caleb had never in his life received from anyone over the age of 12, and something warm spread through his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. They texted every day after that. Not constantly. Caleb's phone stayed in his truck during work hours, and Vanessa ran a company that apparently required her attention 18 hours a day. But in the margins. Early mornings before the world demanded things from them. Late nights after Oliver was asleep and the house was quiet, and Caleb was lying on his mattress staring at the ceiling, his body aching and his mind running, and his phone would buzz and it would be her. She told him about board meetings where men twice her age talked over her until she said the same thing louder and with more data. He told her about the time Oliver brought a dead beetle to school for show and tell and announced to the class that it died of natural causes, probably stress. She told him about the physical therapy sessions that left her so exhausted she sometimes fell asleep in the elevator going back to her office. He told her about the night Oliver found him sitting on the kitchen floor at midnight, eating cereal out of the box, and asked very seriously, "Dad, are you having a hard time?" And Caleb had to pretend he had something in his eye. It was easy in a way Caleb hadn't expected anything to be easy ever again. Not because they avoided hard subjects, they didn't, but because neither of them was performing. There was no version of himself he was trying to project. He was a tired man with rough hands and an overdue electric bill and a kid who needed new shoes. She was a woman who ran an empire from a wheelchair and still sometimes cried in her car after events where people stared. They were both damaged, and they both knew it, and there was a strange freedom in that mutual wreckage. 3 weeks after the coffee shop, Vanessa asked to meet Oliver. Caleb almost said no. Not because he didn't want her to meet his son, but because Oliver was the one part of his life he protected with everything he had. Every decision Caleb made ran through a single filter. Is this good for Oliver? And introducing a woman into their world, a woman he'd known for less than a month, a woman whose life was so different from theirs it might as well have been on another planet, felt like a risk he wasn't sure he had the right to take. But Oliver made the decision for him. It happened on a Thursday evening. Caleb was on the phone with Vanessa. They'd graduated from texts to actual calls by then, talking most nights after Oliver went to bed. And he thought his son was asleep. He was wrong. Oliver had gotten up for water and was standing in the hallway in his dinosaur pajamas, listening with the intense focus of a 7-year-old who knows he's hearing something important. "Dad," Oliver said from the doorway, and Caleb nearly dropped the phone. "Who are you talking to?" "A friend." "What kind of friend?" "Just a friend, buddy. Go back to bed." "Is it a girlfriend?" "It's... Oliver, it's late." "You're smiling," Oliver said, and the way he said it, with wonder, like he was observing a rare natural phenomenon, made Caleb's throat tighten. "You don't smile when you talk to Ray." Caleb didn't have an answer for that. On the phone, he could hear Vanessa breathing, waiting, and he could almost feel her trying not to laugh. "Her name is Vanessa," Caleb said. "She's someone I've been talking to. Can I say hi?" "Oliver, please. I'm really good at saying hi. Mrs. DeLuca says I'm the politest kid on the block." Before Caleb could object further, he heard Vanessa's voice through the speaker, warm and slightly nervous. "Hi, Oliver." Oliver's eyes went wide. He walked over, took the phone from Caleb's hand with the solemnity of a diplomat receiving classified documents, and said, "Hi, I'm Oliver. I'm 7. Do you like dinosaurs?" "I do, actually," Vanessa said. "Which one's your favorite?" "Ankylosaurus. Most people say T-Rex, but that's boring. Ankylosaurus had a tail like a wrecking ball and armor on its back. It was basically a tank with legs." "That's a much better answer than T-Rex." "I know. What's your favorite?" There was a pause, then, "Triceratops, 3 horns and a shield face. You can't argue with that design." Oliver looked at Caleb with an expression of deep approval, like Vanessa had passed a test he'd been secretly administering. "She's cool, Dad," he whispered, not quietly enough. They met that Saturday at the park. Caleb had debated locations obsessively. Restaurant felt too formal. The house felt too intimate. Anywhere public risked someone recognizing Vanessa. And finally settled on Grayson Park on the west side, which had a decent playground and enough open space that a wheelchair could move easily on the paved paths. Oliver spotted her van before Caleb did. Is that her? Does she drive a spaceship? It's a van, Oliver. A really nice van. It looks like a spaceship. Vanessa rolled down the ramp with her driver hovering nearby, and Oliver, who had been coached by Caleb to be calm and polite and not ask 100 questions in the first 30 seconds, walked right up to her chair and said, "Your wheels are really shiny. Do they go fast?" Vanessa looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the sky. "Pretty fast," Vanessa said. "Want to see?" She did a quick spin in her chair, the kind of move that looked practiced, like she'd done it 100 times for kids or maybe just for herself when nobody was watching. Oliver clapped and yelled, "Again!" And just like that, whatever awkwardness Caleb had been bracing for evaporated. They spent 3 hours at the park. Oliver talked the entire time. He told Vanessa about Gerald the stuffed T-Rex, about his theory that clouds were actually sleeping dinosaurs, about how his dad made the best scrambled eggs in the world but couldn't cook anything else without the smoke alarm going off. Vanessa listened to every word with the kind of attention that most adults couldn't sustain for 5 minutes with a 7-year-old, and Caleb watched from the bench beside her and felt something open in his chest that had been sealed shut for years. At one point, Oliver ran off to the playground and Caleb and Vanessa sat together in the thin autumn sun, watching him climb a structure that was definitely too advanced for his age, but that he attacked with the reckless confidence of all 7-year-olds. "He's incredible," Vanessa said quietly. "He's a handful." "He's incredible and a handful. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She paused, watching Oliver hang upside down from a bar. "He doesn't look at the chair." "Kids usually don't." "No, it's not that. Some kids stare. Some kids ask loud questions their parents try to shush." Oliver looked at the wheels for about 3 seconds and then moved on to telling me about asteroid impacts. "He doesn't see it as a thing." "He sees a lot of things," Caleb said, "but he decides pretty fast what matters and what doesn't." "Smart kid. Gets it from his mom, probably." The words came out before he could stop them, and they hung in the air like smoke. Caleb clenched his jaw. "Sorry, I don't know why I said that. Because she's still part of the story, whether she's here or not. You don't have to apologize for that." He looked at her. "Most people get uncomfortable when I bring her up. Most people haven't had their spouse walk out on them. I have. Different circumstances, same wound." Oliver came running back then, breathless and red-cheeked, and announced that he was starving and that the only acceptable food was chicken nuggets. Vanessa said she knew a place. Caleb said she didn't have to. Vanessa said she wanted to. Oliver said, "Please, Dad," in the voice that had a roughly 97% success rate, and 20 minutes later they were in a booth at a diner called Franklin's on the east side where the chicken nuggets came shaped like dinosaurs, and Oliver declared it the greatest restaurant in the history of the planet. The meal was messy and loud and imperfect in all the ways real life is imperfect. Oliver spilled his juice. Caleb knocked the ketchup bottle onto the floor. Vanessa's wheelchair didn't quite fit under the table, so she sat at an angle that made reaching her food awkward. And when Caleb noticed her struggling to grab a fry, he slid the plate closer without saying anything, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, but that stayed with him for days afterward. After that, Vanessa became part of their routine in ways that felt natural and terrifying at the same time. She came to the park again the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. She started texting Oliver directly. Caleb had given in and let his son use the old tablet for messages under strict supervision. And their conversations were a mix of dinosaur facts, bad jokes, and Oliver's running commentary on everything from school lunch. The mashed potatoes looked like cement, Vanessa, actual cement, to the neighborhood cat that sat on their porch every morning. "I think he's judging us, like keeping a list of our mistakes." One evening, Vanessa showed up at the house unannounced. Caleb had just gotten home from work and was still in his dusty clothes, standing in the kitchen trying to figure out if the leftover pasta from 2 nights ago was still edible. Oliver opened the front door before Caleb even heard the knock, and there she was on the porch, which, Caleb realized with a lurch of embarrassment, had a step she couldn't get her chair over. "I should have called," she said. "I was in the area and—" "Hang on." Caleb went to the garage, found a scrap piece of plywood, and laid it over the step to make a ramp. It was ugly and precarious, and Vanessa looked at it with an expression that was half touched and half concerned for her safety. "It'll hold," he said. "Probably." Probably is not the word I want to hear when trusting a stranger's construction skills to prevent me from tipping backward. I'm not a stranger. You're a stranger who builds things for a living and just used the word probably about a ramp made from scrap wood. Just get on the ramp, Vanessa. She did. It held. She rolled into the living room and Oliver tackled her with a hug that nearly tipped the chair sideways, and Caleb stood in the doorway of his shabby little house watching a billionaire and his 7-year-old son argue about which dinosaur would win in a fight. Oliver insisted Spinosaurus, Vanessa made a passionate case for Giganotosaurus. And he thought, I have no idea what's happening to my life, but I don't want it to stop. That night, after Oliver fell asleep on the couch with his head on Vanessa's armrest, and Gerald the T-Rex wedged between them, Caleb carried his son to bed and came back to find Vanessa sitting in the living room looking at the photos on the wall. There weren't many. Oliver's school pictures. A shot of Caleb and Oliver at the county fair from last summer, both of them squinting into the sun, Oliver holding a cotton candy bigger than his head. A faded photo of Caleb's parents that he kept near the window even though the sun was slowly bleaching it into nothing. No photos of her, Vanessa said. Not a question. I took them down when Oliver started asking questions I couldn't answer. Caleb sat on the arm of the couch. Seemed easier than trying to explain why Mommy was in the pictures but not in the house. Do you still think about her? Not the way you'd think. I don't miss her exactly. I miss the idea that someone was supposed to be here. The empty space bothers me more than the person who left it. I understand that. After Damien left, I redecorated my entire apartment. New furniture, new art, new everything. And then I sat in the middle of this beautiful, expensive, perfectly designed space and felt absolutely nothing. Because the problem was never the furniture. Caleb looked at her. The lamp next to the couch cast warm light across half her face and left the other half in shadow. She looked tired in the way he recognized. Not the tiredness that sleep could fix, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles into your bones when you've been carrying something alone for too long. Can I tell you something weird? He said. Weird is my favorite category. I keep waiting for you to realize this doesn't make sense. You and me. I work 60 hours a week with my hands and come home smelling like sawdust and sweat. You run a billion-dollar company. Our lives don't even overlap. Every morning I wake up and check my phone expecting a message that says, thanks, but this was a mistake. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she wheeled her chair closer to where he sat, close enough that he could see the faint scar along her left temple from the accident, the one she usually covered with her hair. You want to know what my life actually looks like? She said. I live in a penthouse that costs more per month than most people make in a year. I have a driver, an assistant, a housekeeper, and a physical therapist. I eat meals prepared by someone I've never met, in rooms where I'm the only person sitting at the table. I go to events where every single person is either trying to sell me something or pretending the wheelchair isn't there. I have 400 employees who call me Ms. Whitmore and exactly 0 people who call me by my first name. She paused. And then I come here to this tiny house with the broken step and the leaky faucet and the stuffed dinosaur on the couch, and your son falls asleep against my chair, and you make terrible coffee and don't care that I can't stand up. And it's the only place in my entire life where I feel like an actual human being instead of a brand or a balance sheet. Caleb didn't say anything for a long time. The faucet dripped in the kitchen. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the block. The house settled and groaned the way old houses do, all its imperfections audible. My coffee isn't terrible, he said finally. She laughed. It was the fullest laugh he'd heard from her. Not the careful, measured thing she used at public events, but something raw and unpracticed, like a muscle she was using for the first time in years. It cracked open something between them that had been building for weeks. Some final wall that they'd both been maintaining out of habit or fear, or the learned belief that wanting something good was the fastest way to lose it. Stay for dinner, Caleb said. I can't promise it'll be good. Oliver will want dinosaur nuggets again, and I think we're out, so it might be scrambled eggs. I love scrambled eggs. You say that now. Wait until you see my technique. It involves a lot of optimism and very little skill. She stayed. The eggs were slightly overdone and undersalted, and they ate them on paper plates because the dishwasher, which was Caleb, since they didn't own an actual dishwasher, was behind schedule. Oliver woke up halfway through, stumbled into the kitchen rubbing his eyes, saw Vanessa and said, "Oh good, you're still here," like her presence was the most normal thing in the world, and then asked for toast. It was, by any reasonable standard, a terrible dinner. The eggs were mediocre. The toast was burned on one side. The kitchen table wobbled, and the overhead light buzzed, and Oliver dropped his fork twice, and Gerald fell off the chair 3 times. But Vanessa ate every bite. And when Caleb looked across the table at her, this woman worth $2 billion sitting in his cramped kitchen on a Wednesday night, eating burned toast off a paper plate while a 7-year-old explained in exhaustive detail why Stegosaurus plates were probably for temperature regulation and not defense. He felt something he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. Not happiness, exactly. It was more fundamental than that. It was the sensation of a life that had been running on fumes for 6 years, finally, slowly, impossibly, filling back up. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2. Vanessa came over on weekday evenings when her schedule allowed. She took Oliver to the Natural History Museum on a Saturday, and he talked about it for 9 straight days. She helped Caleb fix the porch step, actually fix it, not the plywood situation, after watching a YouTube tutorial on her phone and directing him with the intensity of someone managing a corporate merger. The ramp stayed, rebuilt properly with pressure-treated lumber and a gentle slope that met code. It was the first modification anyone had ever made to the house for her, and when Caleb finished it, she sat at the bottom looking up at him and said nothing, but her eyes were red. They hadn't kissed. They hadn't defined what they were. They existed in some space between friendship and something bigger, a space that felt simultaneously fragile and solid, and neither of them wanted to push too hard for fear the whole thing would shatter. And then, on a Tuesday in December, Caleb's phone rang at work. He was on the 2nd floor of Lot 17, driving nails into a header, and almost didn't hear it over the compressor. He pulled off his gloves and looked at the screen. Unknown number. He normally wouldn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Caleb Foster?" "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Martin Ashworth. I'm an attorney with Ashworth, Cole & Gentry. I'm calling to inform you that a civil complaint has been filed against you by Damian Whitmore." The hammer slipped from Caleb's hand and hit the subfloor with a thud that echoed through the framing. "I'm sorry." "What?" "Mr. Whitmore is alleging undue influence and financial manipulation regarding your relationship with his ex-wife, Vanessa Whitmore. The complaint has been filed in district court. You'll receive formal service within the next 48 hours. Caleb stood there on the unfinished 2nd floor of a house he would never live in, surrounded by sawdust and raw lumber and the sound of nail guns firing on the floor below, and felt the ground beneath him crack open in a way that had nothing to do with construction. I haven't taken anything from anyone. I don't even know what undue influence means. I'd recommend you retain legal counsel as soon as possible, Mr. Foster. The complaint is extensive." The line went dead. Caleb stood there for a long time. The wind came through the open framing and cut across his face. His phone was still pressed to his ear, buzzing with silence, and below him the crew kept working, the nail guns firing their relentless rhythm, building walls and floors and roofs for people whose lives were simple enough to fit inside them. He called Vanessa from the parking lot of the construction site, sitting in his truck with the engine off and his hands still shaking. She picked up on the 2nd ring, and before she even said hello, he told her everything the lawyer had said, word for word, because he'd been repeating it in his head for the last 40 minutes, and it had burned itself into his memory like a brand. When he finished, the line was quiet for so long he thought the call had dropped. "Vanessa? I'm here." Her voice was flat. Not calm. Flat. The kind of flat that happens when someone is processing something so enormous that all the emotional registers shut down at once to keep the system from overloading. "What was the attorney's name again?" "Martin Ashworth. Ashworth, Cole & something." "Ashworth, Cole & Gentry. They're Damian's firm. They've been his firm since before the divorce." She paused. "He's been planning this." "Planning what? What is he even accusing me of? I haven't taken a dime from you. I've never asked you for anything." "It doesn't matter what's true, Caleb. It matters what he can make a courtroom believe." "That's insane." "That's the legal system when you can afford the right lawyers." Caleb pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. The vinyl was cold and cracked and smelled like the pine air freshener Oliver had picked out at the gas station 3 weeks ago. His mind was racing in circles that went nowhere. Undue influence, financial manipulation. These were words from a world he didn't belong to, a world of depositions and filings and legal fees that probably cost more per hour than he made in a week. "I can't afford a lawyer," he said. "I can barely afford the gas to get to work." "You don't need to afford a lawyer. I have a legal team that—" "No." "Caleb, no. If I show up to court with your lawyers defending me, it proves his point. Rich woman's legal team protects the broke guy she's involved with. That's exactly the story he's trying to tell." She went quiet again. He could hear her breathing, controlled, deliberate, the way she breathed during her physical therapy sessions when the pain was bad and she was trying to keep it off her face. "You're right," she said finally. "I hate that you're right, but you're right. So what do I do?" "Let me make some calls. Not my lawyers, people who know people. There are attorneys who handle cases like this, people who don't charge what Damien's firm charges." "I don't want your charity either." "It's not charity, Caleb. A man I used to be married to is coming after someone I care about because he can't stand the idea that I moved on. This isn't about money. This is about Damien being Damien." Her voice cracked on his name, just barely, like a hairline fracture running through glass. "Let me help, please." He sat there for a long time, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. A couple of guys from the crew walked past his truck, glanced in, and kept going. Ray stopped and made a questioning gesture through the window. "You okay?" Caleb waved him off. "Okay," he said to Vanessa. "Make your calls." The formal papers arrived 2 days later, delivered by a process server who knocked on the door at 6 in the evening while Caleb was giving Oliver a bath. Caleb opened the door in a damp t-shirt with soap suds on his forearms and accepted the envelope with the numb politeness of a man receiving news he already knew was coming. The complaint was 37 pages long. He read it at the kitchen table after Oliver was in bed, and by page 12, his hands were shaking again. The complaint alleged that Caleb had deliberately targeted Vanessa Whitmore, a person of diminished emotional capacity following a traumatic physical injury, with the intent of establishing a romantic relationship for the purpose of gaining access to her financial resources. It cited the dating app message, the prank, as evidence of calculated initial contact. It described Caleb's financial situation in humiliating detail: his income, his debts, his credit score, the value of his truck, the rent on his house. It painted a picture of a man drowning in poverty who had found a life buoy in a vulnerable billionaire and was holding on with both hands. And then, on page 23, the complaint mentioned Oliver. It alleged that Caleb had strategically introduced his minor child into the relationship dynamic to manipulate Vanessa's emotions and accelerate emotional dependency. It described Oliver as a tool of psychological manipulation and argued that Caleb had used his son's sympathetic circumstances to exploit Vanessa's documented emotional vulnerabilities. Caleb put the papers down. He walked to the kitchen sink, turned on the cold water, and held his hands under it until they stopped trembling. Then he stood there with water running over his fingers, staring at the dark window, and felt something harden inside him that hadn't been there before. They could come after him. They could drag his poverty through a courtroom and call him a con artist, and paint him as whatever story Damien's expensive lawyers wanted to tell. He'd survived that. He'd been surviving worse for 6 years, but they had put Oliver's name in a legal document and called his son a tool. That was a line. The attorney Vanessa found was a woman named Grace Takeda, who worked out of a small office above a Thai restaurant on Merchant Street. She was in her mid-40s, wore reading glasses that she constantly pushed up her nose, and had a reputation, Vanessa said, for handling David versus Goliath cases with a stubbornness that bordered on religious fervor. Her fee was significantly less than what Damien's team charged, which still meant Caleb had to empty what was left of his savings and sell the one thing of value he owned, his father's watch, a beat-up Omega that had been sitting in a drawer since the funeral. He sold it online for $800 and tried not to think about it. Grace read the complaint in front of him during their first meeting, turning pages with the speed of someone who'd spent 2 decades reading legal garbage and could sort the real threats from the theater in seconds. When she finished, she set the papers down, took off her glasses, and looked at him. This is a revenge filing, she said. About 60% of it is designed to intimidate, and about 40% is designed to embarrass. The legal merits are thin. The problem is, thin doesn't mean zero. What does that mean? It means Damien's not trying to win. He's trying to make this as painful and public as possible so you walk away from Vanessa on your own. The lawsuit is a weapon, not a case. And if I don't walk away, then it goes to trial and we fight it. But I'm going to be honest with you, Caleb. Fighting this means your entire life becomes a courtroom exhibit. Your finances, your history, your parenting, your relationship, all of it gets picked apart by lawyers who are very, very good at making decent people look terrible. They mentioned my son. Grace nodded slowly. I saw that. The tool of manipulation language. It's inflammatory and it's meant to be. They want you angry. Angry defendants make mistakes. Am I not supposed to be angry? You're supposed to be angry. You're just not supposed to show it in the courtroom. The pretrial months were brutal in ways Caleb hadn't imagined possible. He thought the hard part would be the legal strategy, the documents, the preparation. What he hadn't anticipated was the way the lawsuit bled into every corner of his life, like water finding cracks in a foundation. At work, word got around. Somebody saw something online. Damien's legal team had made sure the filing generated press coverage, and Caleb's name appeared in 3 different articles alongside phrases like alleged financial predator and construction worker targets disabled billionaire. Derek Haynes, the same guy who'd started the whole thing with the prank, had the decency to look sick about it, but not enough decency to say anything useful. The other guys on the crew treated Caleb differently, not hostile but cautious, the way people act around someone who's become radioactive through association. Ray pulled him aside one morning before the shift started. They were standing by the portable toilets, which was not an ideal setting for a serious conversation, but privacy options were limited on a construction site. You need time off for this court stuff. You take it, Ray said. I'll cover your hours. I can't afford time off. And I can't afford my best framer having his head somewhere else when he's 40 feet up on a truss. Take the time, Caleb. I mean it. At home, things were harder. Oliver had started asking questions. A kid at school had heard something from a parent who'd read something online, and now Oliver wanted to know why someone was saying bad things about his dad. Caleb sat on the edge of Oliver's bed one night, Gerald the T-Rex between them, and tried to explain a lawsuit to a 7-year-old without lying and without scaring him. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things, he said, and when they can't work it out themselves, they go to a place called court where other people help decide who's right. Are you right? Yeah, buddy, I'm right. Then why are they saying mean things? Because sometimes people say mean things when they're angry, even when those things aren't true. Oliver thought about this. Like when Marcus at school said I was stupid because I got the math problem wrong, but I actually just forgot to carry the one. Exactly like that. Mrs. Diane made him apologize. Well, in grown-up court, it takes a little longer than that. That's dumb. Yeah, Caleb said. It kind of is. Oliver was quiet for a moment, hugging Gerald against his chest. Then he looked up with eyes that were too old for his face and said, Is Vanessa going to stop coming over? No, Vanessa's not going anywhere. Promise? Promise. He said it with more certainty than he felt, because that was the job. That was what being a parent meant, absorbing the fear so your kid didn't have to carry it. Vanessa, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle. Damien's lawsuit had a dual target, Caleb publicly, Vanessa privately. The filings referred to her as emotionally compromised and psychologically susceptible to manipulation, language that her own legal team said amounted to arguing she was too disabled to make her own decisions about who to date. It was patronizing and ugly and calculated to do maximum damage to her reputation in the tech industry, where perception was currency. She called Caleb late one night, and he could tell from the first syllable that she'd been crying. Not the quiet kind. The kind that leaves your voice scraped raw. His lawyers filed a motion today to subpoena my medical records, she said. My therapy notes. My physical therapy files. Everything since the accident. Can they do that? They can try. My team is fighting it, but the fact that they even filed the motion means a judge has to consider it. which means someone in a courtroom is going to discuss whether my spinal cord injury makes me mentally incapable of choosing my own relationships. That's dehumanizing. That's the word. It's dehumanizing. Her voice broke. I built a company worth billions of dollars from a wheelchair. I negotiate deals with people who would eat their own children for a competitive advantage. I manage 400 employees across 3 continents. And this man who left me 6 months after I lost the ability to walk, is telling a court that I'm too broken to know when someone actually cares about me. Caleb sat on the floor of his kitchen with his back against the cabinets and his phone pressed to his ear. And he wanted to say something that would make it better. Something smart, something comforting, something that would take the pain out of her voice and replace it with the laugh he'd heard the night she stayed for scrambled eggs. But he didn't have that. He wasn't built for speeches or grand gestures. He was built for showing up and staying put. And right now, that meant sitting on a cold kitchen floor at 11:30 at night and letting her cry without trying to fix it. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know." A long, shaky breath. "That's the thing that kills me. I know you're not." The trial began on a Monday in March in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the district courthouse that smelled like old wood and floor polish, and the accumulated anxiety of 10,000 legal battles. The judge was a woman named Catherine Harwell, mid-60s, with a face that suggested she had seen every form of human pettiness the legal system could produce and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it. Caleb wore the only suit he owned, a dark navy thing he'd bought at a thrift store for $42, and it altered by Mrs. DeLuca, who turned out to be a surprisingly competent seamstress. It fit well enough. Grace had told him to look respectable, but not polished, which was advice that could have described his entire approach to life. Vanessa was already in the courtroom when he arrived, seated at a table on the opposite side from Damien's team. She was in her chair, wearing a dark blazer, her hair pulled back, her face composed in the way he'd learned meant she was terrified underneath. Their eyes met across the room and she gave him a small nod. Not a smile, not a gesture of reassurance, just an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know this is bad. We're doing it anyway." Damien sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than Caleb's truck. He was exactly what his photos suggested. Tall, even seated, impeccably groomed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He didn't look at Caleb. He didn't look at Vanessa either. He looked straight ahead, like the whole proceeding was slightly beneath him. The first 2 days were procedural. Opening statements, motions, legal maneuvering that Grace explained to Caleb in plain English each evening over coffee at her office above the Thai restaurant. "Their strategy is character assassination," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "They're going to make this about who you are, not what you did, because what you did is nothing. You met a woman, you fell for her, you started spending time together. There's no crime in that. So they have to make you look like the kind of person who would commit a crime, and hope the jury fills in the gaps." "And the stuff about Oliver?" Grace hesitated. "They're going to use him. I'm sorry, Caleb. They're going to bring up your son, his school records, his living conditions. They're going to argue that a man in your financial situation, raising a child alone, in a house that size, had every motive in the world to attach himself to a woman with Vanessa's resources. That's not what happened." "I know, and we'll prove that. But you need to be ready for how ugly this is going to get before it gets better." It got ugly fast. On the 3rd day, Damien's lead attorney, a man named Voss with silver hair and the demeanor of a surgeon who enjoyed his work, called Caleb to the stand. The questioning started cordial: background, employment history, family situation, and then pivoted sharply, the way a scalpel turns. "Mr. Foster, when you first contacted Ms. Whitmore through the dating platform, were you aware of her net worth?" "I didn't contact her. A coworker created a fake profile using my information. I've explained this. But after you became aware of the profile and the connection to Ms. Whitmore, you chose to continue the conversation. Is that correct?" I sent her a message apologizing for the prank. And that apology led to a 2-hour conversation, a coffee date, and within weeks, regular visits to her home and involvement with her personal life. That's a rapid escalation, wouldn't you say? Grace objected. The judge sustained it. Voss moved on, but the implication sat in the room like a stain. He asked about Caleb's finances, every credit card balance, every missed payment, every month the electric bill went late. He asked about Oliver's school, about the house, about the truck. He painted a portrait of a man living on the edge of financial collapse, and then he drew a straight line between that portrait and Vanessa Whitmore's bank account. Isn't it true, Mr. Foster, that in the weeks following the beginning of your relationship with Ms. Whitmore, your outstanding debts decreased significantly? She bought Oliver a winter coat because his old one didn't fit anymore. She brought groceries over a couple of times. That's it. Groceries and clothing purchased by a billionaire for a man she'd known less than 2 months. Some might call that generosity. Others might call it a pattern. Caleb gripped the armrest of the witness chair. She bought my kid a coat because he was cold. If that's a pattern, then every decent person I've ever met is running a con. A few people in the gallery shifted. Grace gave him a look that said, "Good, but don't push it." The worst moment came on the 4th day, when Voss brought up Oliver directly. He didn't call the boy to testify. Grace had fought that motion and won. But he introduced Oliver's school records, including a report from his teacher noting that Oliver had been telling classmates about his dad's new friend who has a cool wheelchair and a really big car. A child, Voss said, pacing in front of the jury box, who was deliberately introduced to a vulnerable woman in order to establish an emotional bond that would be difficult to sever. Mr. Foster understood that his son's presence, his innocence, his enthusiasm, would make Ms. Whitmore more emotionally invested in the relationship and less likely to question Mr. Foster's intentions. Caleb sat at the defense table and felt his blood turn to something hot and dangerous. Beside him, Grace put a hand on his arm. Not comforting, restraining. She could feel the tremor running through him. "Easy," she murmured. "Not yet." He breathed. He stayed seated, but something in his chest was building like pressure behind a dam, and he could feel the concrete cracking. Then Vanessa took the stand. She wheeled herself to the witness area, which had been modified with a lower railing to accommodate her chair. She positioned herself facing the jury, and for a moment she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Then she looked directly at the jury box and began to speak. "I am a 31-year-old woman who runs a company with over 400 employees and operations on 3 continents. I manage budgets in the hundreds of millions. I negotiate with investors, governments, and competitors who would love nothing more than to see me fail. I have been doing this from a wheelchair for 2 years, and I have not missed a single quarterly target in that time." She paused. "The idea that I am too fragile, too damaged, or too stupid to know when a man genuinely cares about me is not just wrong. It is insulting. And the fact that this argument is being made by a man who left me 6 months after I was paralyzed, who filed divorce papers while I was still relearning how to get dressed in the morning, should tell this court everything it needs to know about who is manipulating whom." The courtroom was silent. Voss shifted in his chair. Damien's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. Vanessa continued. "Caleb Foster did not target me. He apologized to me. He was honest with me when everyone else in my life was performing. He sat in a coffee shop and talked to me like a person, not like a wheelchair, not like a bank account, not like a problem to be solved. And when his 7-year-old son met me for the first time, do you know what he said? He said, 'Your wheels are really shiny. Do they go fast?' And then he told me about dinosaurs for 45 minutes. Her voice wavered. That child is not a tool. He is the kindest, funniest, most genuine person I've ever met. And the fact that this court has been asked to believe that his father used him as a manipulation tactic is something I will never forgive." Voss stood to cross-examine. He asked a question about the timeline of her relationship with Caleb, and Vanessa answered it clearly. Then he asked a second question, something about whether her emotional state post-accident had affected her judgment. And before Vanessa could respond, Damien leaned toward his other attorney and muttered something. The microphone at the plaintiff's table was still on. The courtroom heard it clearly. "At least the kid's more convincing than she is." Everything stopped. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped backward across the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Grace grabbed for his arm and missed. He crossed the 3 feet to the edge of the defense table and slammed his fist down on it hard enough to make the water pitcher jump. "Say that again." His voice was low and shaking, and every person in that courtroom heard it. "Say that about my son to my face." Judge Harwell's gavel came down like a rifle crack. "Mr. Foster, you will sit down immediately." "He just called my son." "I heard what he said, and I will address it. Sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Caleb stood there, breathing hard, his fist still pressed against the table, his eyes locked on Damien. Damien, for the first time since the trial began, looked unsettled. Not afraid, exactly. Men like Damien didn't get afraid of men like Caleb. But something close. Caught off guard. Exposed. Like the mask had slipped for a second and the thing underneath wasn't ready for daylight. Grace pulled Caleb back into his seat. He sat down. His hand was throbbing. The courtroom was dead silent except for the scratching of a court reporter's keys. Judge Harwell turned to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Whitmore, this court will not tolerate disparaging remarks about a minor, directly or indirectly. One more incident, and I will sanction your legal team and consider further action. Am I clear?" Damien's lead attorney stood and apologized on his client's behalf. Damien said nothing. He straightened his tie and looked forward. But Vanessa was looking at Caleb, and in her face, under the composure and the exhaustion and the fear, he saw something he'd never seen directed at him before. Not from anyone. Not in his entire life. It was the look of someone who had just watched a man stand up in a room full of strangers and fight for something she'd stopped believing anyone would fight for. Not her money, not her company, not even her. Her family. The thing they were becoming, whether they'd said the word out loud or not. The courtroom didn't recover its rhythm after Caleb's outburst. Not really. The judge called a 30-minute recess, and the gallery emptied into the hallway in clusters of murmured conversation. Reporters typing furiously into their phones, attorneys leaning against walls conferring in voices too low to overhear. Grace walked Caleb to a bench near the emergency stairwell, handed him a paper cup of water from the fountain, and sat down next to him without speaking. His right hand was swelling. He flexed the fingers slowly, watching the knuckles turn purple along the ridge where they'd connected with the table. It hurt in a dull, satisfying way, the kind of pain that felt earned. "That can't happen again," Grace said. "I know." "I'm serious, Caleb. You gave them exactly what they wanted. The angry, volatile, working-class guy who can't control himself in a formal setting. Voss is probably in the bathroom right now, practicing how to reference that moment in his closing argument. He called Oliver a prop. I heard what he called him, and the judge heard it too, which matters more than anything you could have done by slamming a table. Harwell is sharp. She registered it. She'll factor it in. But if you just sat there and let the microphone do the work, we'd be in a much stronger position right now than we are." Caleb stared at the scuffed tile floor. A janitor had been through recently. He could smell the chemical lemon of floor cleaner, the same kind they used at Oliver's school. He thought about his son sitting in Mrs. DeLuca's living room right now, watching cartoons, eating the goldfish crackers she always kept in the pantry. Unaware that 3 miles away, a room full of adults in expensive clothes were debating whether his existence was a calculated strategy. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we do the thing that actually wins cases. We put the evidence in front of the jury and trust them to see through the performance." Grace pushed her glasses up. Damien's team has been running on theatrics. Big accusations, dramatic language, emotional manipulation of the jury's sympathies. But the actual evidence they've presented is thin. There's no financial trail, no transfers, no gifts beyond the coat and groceries, no shared accounts, no insurance changes, no property dealings. Everything they've alleged is based on inference and innuendo. And what do we have? We have the truth, which I know sounds like something a lawyer says in a movie right before everything goes wrong. But in this case, the truth is genuinely on our side. The timeline supports you, the financial records support you, Vanessa's testimony supports you, and Damien just insulted a 7-year-old on a live microphone in front of a jury, which is the kind of mistake money can't fix. The trial resumed at 1:15. The gallery was fuller now. Word had spread about the microphone incident, and the press section had doubled. Caleb sat at the defense table with his swollen hand under the surface, hidden, and focused on keeping his face neutral in the way Grace had coached him. Don't react. Don't flinch. Let them talk and trust the process. Grace called her first witness that afternoon, Caleb's foreman, Ray Maddox. Ray walked to the stand the way he walked everywhere, slowly, like a man who knew where he was going and wasn't in a hurry to get there. He was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that still had the crease marks from the package, and his red hair was combed flat in a way that made him look vaguely uncomfortable, like a bear that had been dressed for a wedding. Grace established his credentials: 16 years in construction, 8 as a foreman, Caleb's direct supervisor for the past 4 years, and then asked him to describe Caleb as an employee. "He's the first one on site and the last one off," Ray said. "Never late, never short on his hours, never cuts corners. I've had maybe 100 guys come through my crew in the years I've been running it, and Caleb's in the top 3, maybe top 2. Would you describe Mr. Foster as someone focused on financial gain?" Ray actually laughed, a short bark that echoed off the courtroom walls. "Ma'am, the man drives a truck with 200,000 miles on it and eats peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every single day. He's not focused on financial gain. He's focused on keeping the lights on and getting his kid to school." In your observation, has Mr. Foster's behavior or lifestyle changed since he began his relationship with Miss Whitmore? "Yeah, he smiles sometimes now. That's about it." There was a ripple in the gallery. Not laughter exactly. Something warmer than that. Recognition. A few of the jurors shifted in their seats. Voss cross-examined briefly, trying to establish that Ray's loyalty to Caleb made him a biased witness, but Ray handled it with the blunt patience of a man who'd spent decades managing fragile egos on construction sites. When Voss pressed him on whether Caleb had ever expressed interest in Vanessa's wealth, Ray looked at him with genuine confusion and said, "The man sold his dead father's watch to pay his legal fees for this trial. Does that sound like someone who's getting rich off a relationship?" Voss moved on. The next 2 days belonged to Grace. She was methodical in a way that didn't make for dramatic television, but that slowly, steadily built something structural, like framing a house, Caleb thought, laying boards and driving nails, making something that would hold weight. She introduced bank records showing Caleb's account activity for the entire duration of his relationship with Vanessa. No deposits, no transfers, no unusual purchases. The same bi-weekly paycheck from the construction company, the same rent payments, the same utility bills, the same grocery charges at the same discount supermarket. His financial life after meeting Vanessa was identical to his financial life before meeting her, down to the dollar. She introduced text messages, hundreds of them, submitted with Caleb's consent, that showed the actual content of his relationship with Vanessa. Conversations about Oliver's school projects, arguments about which dinosaur was the most overrated, a running joke about Caleb's inability to make coffee that didn't taste like motor oil, a late-night exchange where Vanessa told him about a board meeting that had gone badly, and Caleb responded with, "That sounds terrible. Want me to bring over eggs? I know they won't fix anything, but at least you won't be hungry and angry at the same time." She put the messages on the overhead screen one by one, and the courtroom read them in silence. And what they saw was not a con artist working a mark. What they saw was two people, both damaged, both exhausted, both carrying things they'd been carrying alone for years, slowly and awkwardly learning how to be around each other. The texts were clumsy and honest and sometimes funny and sometimes raw, and they painted a picture that no amount of legal theater could counter because the picture was real. Voss tried. He objected to the admissibility of the texts. He argued selective presentation. He suggested the messages had been curated to exclude incriminating exchanges. Grace countered with the complete, unedited phone records from the carrier, time-stamped and verified, showing that nothing had been removed or altered. On the 6th day, Grace called her final witness, Vanessa Whitmore, back on the stand for the defense. Vanessa wheeled herself to the witness area for the second time, and this time something was different. The first time she'd testified, she'd been controlled, precise, her emotion measured and deliberate. This time she looked tired. Not the performative kind of tired that people show when they want sympathy. Actually tired, the way Caleb recognized. The bone-deep kind that sits behind your eyes and doesn't leave. Grace asked her to describe the first time Caleb came to her penthouse. "He didn't," Vanessa said. "He's never been to my penthouse. I went to his house. A small rental on the south side of the city with a broken front step and a kitchen light that buzzes." "Why did you go to his home instead of inviting him to yours?" "Because his home felt real. My penthouse is beautiful and empty, and it echoes when you walk through it. His house has crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator and a stuffed dinosaur on the couch, and a boy who falls asleep watching nature documentaries. It felt like somewhere a person actually lives. Did Mr. Foster ever ask you for money? No. Did he ever discuss your finances? Once. I offered to pay for Oliver's winter coat, and he told me no 3 times before I bought it anyway while he was in the bathroom. He was angry about it for 2 days. He was angry that you bought his son a coat? He was angry because he felt like he should be able to buy it himself. He told me, "I've been taking care of my kid alone for 6 years, and I don't need anyone to remind me of what I can't afford." And I said, "I'm not reminding you. I'm buying a coat because it's December and your son's sleeves don't reach his wrists." And he stared at me for about 10 seconds and then said, "Fine, but I'm paying you back." He still hasn't, by the way. I think we both know he's never going to, and I think we both know it drives him insane. A woman on the jury, mid-50s, sitting in the back row, covered her mouth. It wasn't clear if she was hiding a smile or trying not to cry. Grace paused, letting the moment sit. Then she asked, "Ms. Whitmore, in your professional life, you negotiate with some of the most sophisticated business minds in the world. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And in those negotiations, you've encountered people who are attempting to deceive you, to manipulate you, to gain advantage through dishonest means?" "Many times." "Can you describe how you identify those people?" Vanessa thought about it, not performatively, actually thought the way she probably thought in boardrooms before delivering an answer that would move markets. "People who want something from you are very careful," she said. "They agree with everything you say. They mirror your emotions. They never push back, never challenge you, never make you uncomfortable. They're smooth." She paused. "Caleb Foster is the least smooth person I have ever met. He argued with me about coffee on our first date. He told me my company's mobile app had terrible navigation, which, for the record, it did, and we've since redesigned it. He fell asleep during a movie I was excited about and didn't even pretend to be sorry. He once told me that my penthouse looks like a hotel lobby that got depressed. He is not manipulating me. He is the first person in years who has been completely, sometimes painfully, honest with me." Grace turned to the jury. No further questions. Voss cross-examined. He tried to poke holes in the timeline, in Vanessa's emotional state, in the reliability of her judgment post-accident. Vanessa answered every question with the same steady, exhausted precision. And when Voss suggested that her attachment to Caleb was a trauma response rather than a genuine connection, she looked at him and said, "Mr. Voss, I've been in therapy for 2 years. I have an excellent therapist. She and I have discussed my relationship with Caleb extensively. If my judgment were compromised, she would have told me, because unlike most people in my life, she has no financial incentive to agree with me." The closing arguments came on the 7th day. Voss spoke for 45 minutes. He was polished, organized, and technically excellent, and he painted a picture of a vulnerable woman who had been caught in the orbit of a desperate man. He used words like concerning pattern and emotional exploitation and power imbalance. And he spoke about Oliver with the careful, regretful tone of a man who was sorry to bring a child into this, but felt obligated to point out that the child's involvement was itself evidence of manipulation. Grace spoke for 20 minutes. She stood in front of the jury box with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and her hands in the pockets of her blazer, and she talked the way she always talked, direct, plain, like she was explaining something to a neighbor over a fence. "This case," she said, "is about a man who was embarrassed by a prank and chose to apologize instead of pretending it didn't happen. It's about a woman who'd been abandoned by her husband and treated like either a trophy or a burden by everyone who came after. It's about 2 people who met by accident, talked for hours because neither of them had anyone to talk to, and slowly, carefully, built something real in a world that told both of them they didn't deserve it." She paused. "The plaintiff wants you to believe this is a story about money. But there is no money in this story. There are no transfers, no gifts, no accounts, no deals. What there is, and what you've seen in 7 days of testimony, is a man who drives a truck with 200,000 miles on it and sells his father's watch to pay his legal bills, and a woman who leaves a penthouse on a Tuesday night to eat scrambled eggs in a kitchen where the light buzzes. There is a 7-year-old boy who told his new friend that her wheels were shiny and who has been called, in a court of law, a tool of manipulation." She looked at each juror individually. Damian Whitmore left his wife when she needed him most. He filed for divorce while she was relearning how to live. And now he has filed a lawsuit to punish her for finding someone who stayed. That is not a case. That is revenge. And I trust you to see the difference." She sat down. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 16 minutes. Caleb spent the time sitting on the bench outside the courtroom, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Grace went to get food. Vanessa sat beside him in the hallway, close enough that he could hear the small sounds of her chair, the creak of the armrest, the soft squeak of a wheel that needed oil. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Vanessa said, "Whatever happens in there, I need you to know something." He looked at her. "The night you slammed that table, I was angry at you. Grace was right. It was reckless, and it could have cost us the case. But when I was lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in my ridiculous penthouse, all I could think about was that no one has ever stood up for me like that. Not Damien, not my board, not my lawyers or my friends or my family. No one has ever looked at someone who was hurting the people I love and said, 'Say that to my face,' with that kind of fury." She swallowed. "And I realized something. I've spent 2 years proving to the world that I'm still strong, that the chair didn't break me, that I can still run a company and make decisions and live a full life, and all of that is true. But I forgot what it felt like to have someone be strong for me. Not because I'm weak, but because I matter enough to someone that they can't sit still when I'm being hurt." Caleb reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. His were still swollen, the knuckles bruised and stiff. They fit together badly, her hand too small, his too rough, the grip uneven and imperfect. "I'm sorry about the table," he said. "No, you're not." "No, I'm not." The bailiff appeared in the hallway and told them the jury was back. They filed into the courtroom. Caleb to the defense table, Vanessa to her position behind it, Grace already standing with her hands clasped in front of her. Across the aisle, Damien sat with his attorneys, his posture unchanged, his expression the same studied neutrality he'd worn for 7 days. The jury foreperson stood. She was a woman in her 30s, dark hair, glasses, the kind of face that gave away nothing. She read from a slip of paper. "On the count of undue influence, not liable. On the count of financial manipulation, not liable. On the count of emotional exploitation, not liable. All counts unanimously in favor of the defense." And then, in a turn that made Grace's eyebrows rise and Voss physically flinch, the judge announced that the court had reviewed the basis of the plaintiff's claims and found them to be filed in bad faith and with intent to harass. Damien Whitmore was ordered to pay the entirety of the defendant's legal fees plus additional sanctions that the judge would determine at a later hearing. Damien's face didn't crack. It shifted. The smallest movement, like a building settling. Not a collapse, but the beginning of one. His attorneys were already leaning in, whispering, strategizing, doing the thing they did. But Damien sat still and stared at the judge's bench with the look of a man who had been certain of the outcome and was now processing the fact that certainty had been wrong. Caleb didn't look at him. He turned in his seat and looked at Vanessa, who was sitting behind him with both hands gripping her armrests, her composure finally breaking, tears running down her face in clean, silent lines. "It's over," Grace said, putting her hand on Caleb's shoulder. He nodded. But he wasn't listening to Grace. He was watching Vanessa cry in a courtroom that had spent a week trying to prove she was broken, and he was thinking that she was the strongest person he had ever known, and that the word broken had never once, in all the months he'd known her, been the right word for what she was. He stood up, walked around the table, and crouched beside her chair. She grabbed the front of his thrift store suit with both hands, pulling the fabric tight in her fists, and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. He put one arm around her and held her there, in the middle of the courtroom, with the gallery watching and the reporters writing and the judge shuffling papers and the whole machinery of the legal system grinding on around them. "Take me home," she whispered. "Your place or mine?" She pulled back and looked at him with red eyes and a tear-streaked face and the ghost of a smile that was trying to form through the wreckage. "Yours," she said. "I want scrambled eggs." They drove home in Caleb's truck, not Vanessa's van with the driver and the hydraulic lift and the leather seats that cost more than Caleb's monthly rent. His truck. The 2004 Ford with the dent in the passenger door and the check engine light that had become a permanent companion and the tape deck that hadn't worked since before Oliver was born. Grace helped them figure out the logistics. The wheelchair folded and went in the truck bed, secured with bungee cords Caleb kept behind the seat, and Vanessa transferred into the passenger seat with Caleb's help, which was clumsy and graceless and involved him nearly dropping her once, and her grabbing the O-handle above the door so hard her knuckles turned white. "If you drop me in this parking lot after everything I've been through today, I will sue you," she said. "Get in the truck, Vanessa." She got in the truck. He closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and sat behind the wheel. For a moment, neither of them moved. The parking garage was dim and smelled like exhaust and concrete, and through the windshield they could see nothing but the gray wall and a sign that said Level 3, Compact Vehicles Only. "We should go," Vanessa said. "Yeah. You're not starting the truck." "I know, I just need a second." She looked at him. He was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, his bruised knuckles tight against the cracked vinyl, and his jaw was clenched in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something together that wanted to come apart. He'd been holding things together for 7 days, for months before that, for 6 years before that. The man had been clenching his jaw and swallowing it down and getting up at 4 in the morning and doing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and she could see in the dim light of the parking garage the exact moment the weight of all of it landed. His eyes got red. He didn't cry. She wasn't sure he knew how anymore, or if he'd buried that ability so deep it couldn't surface. But his breathing changed, got ragged, and he pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there. Vanessa put her hand on the back of his neck. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that about Caleb, that words, when things were at their heaviest, weren't what he needed. He needed someone to be there without filling the silence with reassurances that might not be true. He needed presence without performance. After about a minute, he lifted his head, exhaled hard, and started the truck. The engine turned over on the third try, which was actually a good day for it. "That thing you said in the courtroom," he said as they pulled out of the garage into the late afternoon sun. "About nobody standing up for you." "Yeah? I need you to know that wasn't bravery. That was rage. I saw his mouth move and I heard what he said about Oliver and my body just went. Grace is right that it was stupid. It could have blown the whole case." "I know. I'm not a hero. I'm a guy who lost his temper in a courtroom." Vanessa watched the city pass through her window. The storefronts, the traffic, the people walking dogs and carrying groceries, all the ordinary machinery of ordinary life. "You want to know the difference between you and every other man I've known? Every other man in my life has been careful. Careful with their words, careful with their image, careful with how they position themselves relative to my money and my chair. Damien was careful. My board members are careful. My lawyers are careful. You are the most reckless, impulsive, poorly strategized person I have ever met, and that's why I trust you. Because you can't fake reckless. That might be the worst compliment anyone's ever given me. Take it anyway." They picked up Oliver from Mrs. DeLuca's house. She met them at the door with the boy already in his jacket, Gerald tucked under one arm, a Ziploc bag of cookies in the other hand. "For the victory," she said, though Caleb hadn't told her the verdict. Mrs. DeLuca had a way of knowing things before anyone said them, a skill she attributed to 71 years of paying attention. Oliver climbed into the truck's back seat, the extended cab that was really just a suggestion of a back seat, more of a padded shelf, and immediately noticed Vanessa. "You're in Dad's truck," he said, as though this were the most significant event of the day. "I am. It smells weird in here." "Oliver," Caleb said. "What?" "It does. It smells like trees and old socks." "That's the air freshener and my work boots. Thank you for the review." "Did you win?" Oliver asked, leaning forward between the seats with the intensity of a child who has been waiting all day for one piece of information. Caleb looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, buddy. We won." Oliver threw both arms in the air, nearly hitting the roof. "I knew it. I told Marcus at school that my dad always wins, and he said not always, and I said name one time, and he couldn't because I was right." "Oliver, I don't always win." "You did today. That counts." They went home. The little house on the south side with the rebuilt porch ramp and the buzzing kitchen light and the crack in the living room wall where Oliver said the house was growing. Caleb pulled the wheelchair from the truck bed and set it up on the sidewalk, and Vanessa transferred into it with more ease this time, like they were learning the choreography of each other's needs. Oliver ran ahead and opened the front door, then stood at the top of the ramp like a doorman at a fancy hotel. "Welcome to our house," he said in a deep voice that was his impression of every serious adult he'd ever seen. "We have eggs and cookies and a dinosaur." "That's all I need," Vanessa said. They went inside. Oliver dumped his backpack by the door, kicked off his shoes, and immediately began constructing what he called a victory fort out of couch cushions and blankets in the living room. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Vanessa wheel through his house, past the crayon drawings on the fridge, past the wobbly table, past the framed photo of his parents by the window, and settle near the couch where Oliver was already enlisting her help with fort architecture. This was his life. This cramped, imperfect, barely holding together life. And she was in it, not visiting it, not observing it from a comfortable distance, not studying it like a sociological curiosity. In it, part of it. Arguing with his son about whether the fort needed a second entrance or whether that compromised structural integrity. He made scrambled eggs. They were, as usual, slightly overdone. He put them on paper plates because the real plates were in the sink from that morning and he hadn't had time to wash them. He brought the plates to the living room where Oliver and Vanessa were inside the fort, and the three of them sat on the floor. Vanessa transferred out of her chair and onto a pile of cushions, which she did with a wince and a muttered comment about her physical therapist killing her if she could see this. And they ate eggs and cookies and talked about nothing important. Oliver told Vanessa about a kid in his class who had brought a lizard for show and tell, and the lizard escaped and they had to evacuate the classroom for 20 minutes. Vanessa told Oliver about a board meeting where someone's phone alarm went off playing a song at full volume, and the guy couldn't figure out how to turn it off, and the entire executive team sat there for 45 seconds in excruciating silence. Caleb told them both about the time Ray accidentally nailed his own boot to a subfloor and had to wait for someone to bring a pry bar while standing on one foot like a flamingo. It was stupid and small and exactly what all three of them needed. Oliver fell asleep in the fort at 7:30, which was early even for him. The trial had been hard on the boy in ways Caleb was still measuring. He'd been quiet at school. He'd started sleeping with Gerald again after months of leaving the dinosaur on the shelf. He'd asked Caleb twice if they were going to have to move. Caleb carried him to bed, tucked Gerald under his chin, and stood in the doorway for a moment. Oliver's face in sleep was the same face it had always been. Unguarded, trusting, the face of a kid who still believed his father could fix anything. Caleb wanted to deserve that belief. He wasn't sure he did, but he wanted to. When he came back to the living room, Vanessa had transferred back into her chair and was sitting by the window, looking out at the dark street. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere. A car passed with its headlights sweeping across the wall. "I'm not going back to the penthouse," she said. Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm done. I've been living in that place for 2 years and it's never been a home. It's a building I sleep in. I pay a mortgage that could fund a small country, and I eat dinner alone at a table with 12 chairs, and I wake up in a bed that's so big I could roll over 3 times and not reach the edge." She turned her chair to face him. "I don't want that anymore. I want this." "This," Caleb said, looking around the room. "This house with the cracked wall and the leaky faucet and the kitchen light that sounds like it's planning to electrocute someone. This house where your son builds forts and your neighbor brings cookies and you make terrible eggs and nobody cares what I'm worth or what I can't do." She paused. "I know this is fast. I know we haven't even talked about what we are, but I've spent 2 years overthinking everything and I'm tired of it. I want to be where I feel like a person." "Vanessa, this house is 900 square feet. Your chair barely fits through the hallway. Then we make it fit, or we find a different house, or we build one. You literally build houses for a living, for other people. So build one for us." The word us landed in the room and stayed there. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at this woman, this brilliant, stubborn, exhausted, complicated woman who ran a billion-dollar company and couldn't make scrambled eggs and had just survived a week-long trial orchestrated by a man who wanted to punish her for being happy. And he felt something open in his chest that he'd welded shut 6 years ago when Jenna disappeared. It wasn't certainty. He wasn't sure about anything. He was still broke, still tired, still carrying the scars of a wife who vanished and years of raising a child alone on fumes. He had a swollen hand and a thrift store suit and a truck that needed an alternator and a credit score that would make a loan officer cry. He had nothing to offer that made sense on paper, but he had a son who said, "Oh, good, you're still here," when she showed up. He had a kitchen table where a billionaire ate burned toast off paper plates and called it the best meal she'd had in months. He had a porch ramp he'd built with his own hands. And he had the thing that mattered more than any of the rest of it, the willingness to stay. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, stay. We'll figure it out." That's not exactly a sweeping romantic declaration. "I slammed a table in a courtroom for you. That's the sweeping romantic declaration. This is the practical follow-up." She laughed. That full, raw, unpracticed laugh that he'd first heard the night she stayed for eggs. It filled the small room and bounced off the cracked walls and woke up something in the house itself, some warmth that had been dormant for years. The weeks after the trial moved slowly, the way life moves when the crisis is over and you're left standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out what to rebuild and where to start. Damien's sanctions were finalized in late March. The court ordered him to pay the entirety of Caleb's legal fees, which went to Grace, who called it the most satisfying invoice I've ever sent, plus additional penalties for filing in bad faith. The total was substantial enough to make the news, and the news was not kind to Damien Whitmore. The narrative flipped overnight. The man who'd tried to paint himself as a concerned ex-husband protecting a vulnerable woman was now publicly exposed as a vindictive former spouse who'd weaponized the legal system against a single father. His venture capital firm issued a carefully worded statement about personal matters and mutual respect, which was corporate language for "please stop asking us about this." Two of his major investors quietly pulled their funding within a month. A profile in a business magazine that had been in progress, a flattering piece about his investment philosophy, was killed and replaced with a shorter article about the trial, complete with a photo of Damien leaving the courthouse, looking like a man whose face had just been rearranged by reality. Caleb didn't follow any of it. He found out about most of it from Vanessa, who followed all of it, because she'd earned the right to watch the man who'd tried to destroy her life trip over his own cruelty. "He lost the Meridian Partners deal," she told Caleb one evening. They were on the porch with the ramp, which Caleb had reinforced and widened after Vanessa pointed out that the original build was functional, but not exactly inspiring confidence. And Oliver was in the yard chasing fireflies in the early spring dusk. "I don't know what that means," Caleb said. "It means his biggest investment partner dropped him. It's about 40% of his portfolio." Is that a lot?" "Caleb, it's hundreds of millions of dollars." "Okay, so it's a lot. Do you feel anything about that? Even a little bit of satisfaction?" He thought about it. Genuinely considered whether watching the man who'd called his son a manipulation tactic lose hundreds of millions of dollars brought him any pleasure. The honest answer was complicated. "I feel like he did it to himself," Caleb said. "That's not the same as being happy about it. That's annoyingly mature. Trust me, I'm not mature. I wanted to break his jaw in that courtroom. I still kind of do. But being angry at Damien takes energy, and I've got about enough energy to make it through the day, keep Oliver alive, and maybe do one more thing. I'd rather that one more thing be something that matters." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her file that away the way she filed away everything. Behind her eyes, in whatever mental database ran the same analytical engine that managed her company. She was always processing, always evaluating. It used to make him self-conscious, the feeling that he was being studied. Now he understood it was just how she moved through the world. She gathered information, she assessed, she decided. It was what made her a good CEO. It was also what made her a difficult person to be around sometimes, because she saw everything and forgot nothing and occasionally referenced a conversation from 3 months ago with the precision of someone reading from a transcript. "You know what your one more thing should be?" she said. "What?" "Finish your degree." He laughed. Not a real laugh. A reflexive one. The kind you make when someone suggests something so far outside the boundaries of your reality that your brain processes it as humor. "I'm serious," she said. "Vanessa, I'm 32 years old. I work 60 hours a week. I have a 7-year-old. "You're 32, not 72. You're smart, you're disciplined, and you were 2 years into a business degree before everything happened. You didn't fail out. You walked away because life demanded it. Life is different now. Because you're offering to pay for it? I'm offering to help make it possible. There's a difference. Online programs, night classes, whatever works with your schedule. Oliver's getting older. Mrs. DeLuca can watch him. I can watch him. The point is, you stopped building your life to survive, and now you have the chance to start building it again. He didn't answer right away. He watched Oliver in the yard catching fireflies in a jar, his small body silhouetted against the fading light. The boy was talking to himself, or to the fireflies, it was hard to tell, narrating some elaborate story that involved the bugs being astronauts on a mission to save the galaxy. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's code for no." "It's code for I'll think about it. I'm slow, you know this about me? I run a tech company. I'm used to slow adoption rates." She was right, of course. She was right about most things, which was one of the more irritating aspects of being in a relationship with her. Caleb did think about it, and he thought about it for weeks. And eventually, on a Tuesday night in April, sitting at the kitchen table with Oliver's math homework on one side and Vanessa's laptop on the other, he enrolled in an online program to finish his business degree. He told himself it was practical, that a degree would open doors, that he owed it to Oliver to be more than a guy who swung a hammer. But the real reason, the one he didn't say out loud, was simpler. For 6 years, he'd been in survival mode. Every day was about getting through, making it to the next morning, keeping the lights on, and the kid fed. He'd stopped thinking about the future because the present was consuming everything he had. Vanessa didn't fix that. She didn't rescue him or save him or any of the other words that made it sound like a fairy tale. What she did was stand next to him, or sit next to him, to be precise, and make the future feel like something that existed again. Not guaranteed, not easy, not some golden road stretching out toward a perfect horizon. Just real. Just possible. Just worth planning for. The house changed over the spring and summer, not dramatically. They didn't gut renovate or move to a mansion or do any of the things people might expect when a billionaire moves in with a construction worker. But small things shifted. Caleb fixed the faucet. He replaced the kitchen light with one that didn't buzz. He widened the hallway by taking out a section of wall that wasn't load-bearing so Vanessa's chair could move freely between rooms. He built a wheelchair ramp at the front porch. A real one, not the plywood emergency solution from their first weeks, but a solid, code-compliant ramp with pressure-treated rails and a non-slip surface that he spent 2 weekends on, measuring and leveling and cursing under his breath, while Oliver handed him screws and Vanessa directed from the driveway with the intensity of a field general. Oliver's drawings went up on the fridge next to a photo of the three of them at the park. Vanessa in her chair, Oliver on Caleb's shoulders, all three of them squinting into the sun, none of them posing properly, a blurry, off-center, perfect picture. Oliver started leaving notes on the refrigerator too, in his large, crooked handwriting. "Vanessa, do not eat the last yogurt. It is mine, Oliver. And Dad, your coffee is bad. Sorry. Love, Oliver." And family meeting at 7. Topic: why we need a dog. The dog conversation happened at least 3 times a week. Caleb said no. Vanessa said they should discuss it. Oliver said Gerald was lonely and needed a real friend. It was an ongoing negotiation with no resolution in sight, and it was, somehow, one of the happiest recurring arguments of Caleb's life. Vanessa continued running Prism Digital. She didn't slow down, didn't step back, didn't do any of the things people assumed she would once she settled down, a phrase that made her visibly twitch every time someone used it. She took meetings from the kitchen table. She did video calls from the porch. She once closed a $70 million deal while Oliver sat beside her drawing a picture of a velociraptor in a business suit, which she later had framed and put on her office wall. She didn't move into the house exactly. She was just there. More and more, and then always. Her clothes appeared in the closet. Her shampoo showed up in the shower. A second toothbrush materialized next to Caleb's. Her laptop took permanent residence on the kitchen table, and Caleb learned to work around it the way you learn to work around any new fixture in a house. It was just part of the landscape now. At work, things shifted too. Ray promoted Caleb to foreman in June, a position that came with a raise and fewer hours on the actual tools, and more time managing the crew and coordinating with contractors. Caleb was good at it. He understood the work from the ground up, and the guys respected him because he'd done every job he was now supervising. He still got his hands dirty, old habit, but his knees thanked him for the reduction in physical labor, and his shoulder stopped waking him up at 3 in the morning with that grinding complaint it had been making for years. The guys on the crew knew about Vanessa. It was impossible not to. The trial had been in the news, and even the men who didn't follow current events had heard something from their wives or girlfriends or the internet's relentless churn. Derek Haynes had been fired 2 months after the trial, not for the prank directly, but for a pattern of behavior that HR had been documenting, of which the prank was the most visible example. Nobody mourned his departure. Ray told Caleb about it over coffee one morning, almost as an afterthought. "You hear about Derek?" I heard. "How you feel about that?" "I feel like I stopped thinking about Derek Haynes a long time ago." "Good. That's the right answer." Ray sipped his coffee. "For what it's worth, I should have shut that whole thing down when it happened. The prank. I saw the guys laughing and I smirked along, and I shouldn't have. You also told me to take time off for the trial and covered my hours for 3 weeks. One decent thing doesn't cancel out a lousy one." "Maybe not, but it helps." A year passed. Then it was spring again, and the small house on the south side had become something Caleb wouldn't have recognized 12 months earlier. Not because it was bigger or fancier or worth more money. It was the same 900 square feet with the same crack in the living room wall and the same patch of yard where Oliver caught fireflies. But it was full now. Full in a way that had nothing to do with square footage and everything to do with the people inside it. The refrigerator was covered. Oliver's drawings, Vanessa's post-it notes with meeting reminders, a calendar marked with school events and physical therapy appointments, and Taco Tuesday, written in Oliver's handwriting every single week because the boy had decided it was a non-negotiable family tradition. There were photos everywhere. Oliver's school picture from first grade, the park photo, a candid shot someone had taken at the Natural History Museum of Vanessa and Oliver staring up at a T-Rex skeleton with identical expressions of awe. The ramp at the front porch had become part of the house's identity, as natural as the front steps it sat beside. Neighbors had stopped noticing it. Oliver's friends from school came over and ran up and down it like a slide. Mrs. DeLuca used it because her knees were getting worse, and the ramp was easier than the steps. And she told Caleb she appreciated it with the specific, unsentimental gratitude of a woman who had too much pride to admit she needed help, but not so much that she'd turn it down. Caleb finished his first semester of classes in the spring with a 3.4 GPA, which Grace, who he still met for coffee occasionally because she'd become something like a friend, said was respectable, and Vanessa said was a starting point, and Oliver said was almost as good as my report card, Dad. There was a morning in May that stayed with Caleb, not because anything remarkable happened. Nothing did. That was the point. He woke up at 5:15 instead of 4:15 because the foreman's schedule started later. The alarm went off and he reached over to silence it, and his hand brushed against Vanessa's shoulder. She was sleeping on her side, facing away from him, her breathing slow and even. The bed was too small for both of them. His feet hung off the end, and she'd stolen all the blankets, a nightly theft she denied with complete conviction every morning. But they'd stopped talking about getting a bigger one because neither of them actually wanted to. He got up, went to the kitchen, and started the coffee maker. It worked on the first try now. He'd replaced the power button in January, a $5 fix that had taken him 4 years to get around to. While the coffee brewed, he heard footsteps in the hall. Small ones, then bigger ones. Then the creak of Vanessa's chair on the hardwood. Oliver appeared first in his dinosaur pajamas. Different ones now, a size up, with Triceratops instead of T-Rex because he'd decided T-Rex was too mainstream. He was holding Gerald, who looked increasingly ragged after 7 years of service, one eye missing, the stitching along the belly coming loose in a way that Caleb kept repairing and Oliver kept undoing through sheer force of affection. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, buddy. Is the coffee ready?" "You're 7. You don't drink coffee." "I know, but Vanessa does, and she's cranky before coffee." "I am not cranky," Vanessa said, wheeling into the kitchen with her hair tangled in one of Caleb's flannel shirts over her shoulders, 3 sizes too big. I am focused. She's cranky, Oliver whispered. I heard that. Good. You were supposed to. Caleb poured coffee into the mug with the cartoon dog. He'd bought a second mug, a plain white one from the dollar store, but Vanessa had claimed the dog mug as her own within a week of moving in, and Caleb had surrendered it without a fight because there were battles worth having and mug ownership was not one of them. Oliver climbed onto his chair and opened the cereal box with the focus of a safecracker. Vanessa positioned herself at the table and pulled up her email on her phone, already scanning the day's priorities with the speed-reading intensity that Caleb had stopped finding. Intimidating and now found oddly comforting, like the hum of a machine running the way it was supposed to. I have a board meeting at 10, she said. Oliver, do you have anything at school today? Science fair's Friday. I need a poster board. I'll pick one up. What's your project? Which dinosaur could survive in modern cities? My hypothesis is Ankylosaurus because it's basically armored and doesn't need to run fast. That's genuinely brilliant. I know. Caleb sat down with his coffee and his toast and looked at the two of them across the table. The woman and the boy, both talking at the same time, both completely certain of their own opinions, both totally unaware that they'd given him back something he thought was gone permanently. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't built for declarations or big emotional moments. He was a man who showed up and stayed and fixed the faucet and built the ramp and made the eggs. That was his language. That was how he said the things he didn't have words for. But sitting there in the kitchen of his small house with the morning light coming through the window and his son talking about dinosaur survival strategies and the woman he loved arguing that Pachycephalosaurus would actually be a better urban survivor because its thick skull could handle traffic, Caleb understood something that he hadn't been able to articulate in all the months since the trial, in all the years since Jenna disappeared, in all the long and lonely mornings when he woke up before dawn and wondered what the point of any of it was. The point was this table, this noise, this ordinary, imperfect, chaotic Tuesday morning where nothing was happening except life, and life was enough. He'd spent 6 years believing he was broken, not in the dramatic way, not shattered or destroyed or any of the big words people used, just broken in the quiet way. A crack running through the middle of him that let all the warmth out and all the cold in. He'd built walls around it, kept his head down, raised his son, went to work, came home, repeated. He'd convinced himself that this was fine. That fine was the ceiling, that a man who'd been left by his wife and abandoned by his luck didn't get to want more than fine. Vanessa had believed something similar. She told him once, late at night, when Oliver was asleep and the house was quiet, and they were lying in the too small bed talking the way they talked best. In the dark, without looking at each other, where the words came easier because nobody had to hold an expression. After the accident, she said, I made a deal with myself. I told myself that if I could keep the company running, if I could prove that the chair hadn't taken my brain or my ambition, then that would be enough. That would be the victory. I didn't need love or a family or someone to come home to. I just needed the work. Did you believe that? Completely, for about a year. And then one night I was in my penthouse and my phone rang, and it was you, telling me that Oliver had put together a Lego Stegosaurus and wanted to show me, and you held the phone up so I could see it on video, and Oliver was talking a mile a minute about how the tail was slightly wrong, but he was working on it. And I sat there in my 12-chair dining room, and I cried for 20 minutes after we hung up. You never told me that. I'm telling you now. That was the thing about them. They weren't smooth. They weren't the kind of couple that finished each other's sentences or had romantic dinners or knew the right thing to say at the right moment. They argued about stupid things. Coffee quality, thermostat settings, whether Oliver needed a jacket when it was above 60 degrees. They had bad days where Caleb came home exhausted and distant, and Vanessa was buried in work, and they passed each other in the hallway without really connecting. They had nights where Vanessa's pain was bad, and she was sharp and irritable, and Caleb didn't know how to help, and she didn't know how to ask. They were imperfect, flawed, scarred in ways that didn't always line up neatly. But they stayed. That was the thing. They stayed when it was hard, and they stayed when it was boring, and they stayed when the other person was being difficult, which was often because they were both stubborn and proud and carrying enough old damage to fill a warehouse. They stayed because staying was a choice. and making that choice every single day. Not once, not in a grand gesture, but every morning when the alarm went off and you rolled over and the other person was still there, was the only kind of love that meant anything. Oliver didn't see any of this with the analytical lens of an adult. He was 8 now, about to turn 9, and his understanding of the world was structured around different priorities: dinosaurs, Legos, whether the cafeteria would have pizza on Friday, and the ongoing campaign for a dog. What he understood, in the way children understand things, not with words but with the full weight of their bodies and their instincts, was that his house was warm, his dad was happier, and the woman in the wheelchair who argued with him about dinosaurs and helped him with his science fair project and called him buddy the same way his dad did was not a visitor. She was family. He'd never once, not in all the months she'd been part of their lives, looked at her wheelchair as something unusual. He helped her over rough patches on the sidewalk the way he helped his dad carry groceries, because it was there and it needed doing, and that was what you did for people who were yours. One night, Caleb overheard Oliver talking to Gerald in his bedroom. The boy didn't know anyone was listening, and his voice had that quiet, serious quality it took on when he was working through something important. "Dad's different now," Oliver told the stuffed dinosaur. "He smiles at breakfast. He didn't used to do that. And Vanessa's here, which is good, because she knows about dinosaurs, and she lets me have 2 cookies instead of 1, but don't tell Dad." A pause. Gerald presumably offered counsel. "I think we're a family," Oliver said. "Like a real one. Not a perfect one because Dad can't cook, and Vanessa works too much, and nobody will let me get a dog. But a real one." Caleb stood in the hallway with his hand on the wall and his eyes burning and thought, "Yeah, buddy, a real one. Here's what I've learned from telling this story. Not the facts of it, not the names and dates and courtroom transcripts. Those are the scaffolding. What I've learned is underneath all of that, in the space between the things that happened and the reason they mattered. People talk about love like it's a rescue mission, like one person sweeps in and saves the other, and then the music swells and the credits roll. We've been telling that story for centuries, in books, in movies, in the fairy tales we hand our kids at bedtime. And it's a beautiful story. It's just not a true one. What Caleb and Vanessa had was not a rescue. He didn't save her from her wheelchair or her loneliness or her empty penthouse. She didn't save him from his poverty or his exhaustion or the ghost of a wife who disappeared. They didn't complete each other, the way people say in wedding speeches and greeting cards. They were both incomplete when they met, and they were both incomplete after, because that's what being human is. Walking around with missing pieces and pretending you can't feel the wind coming through the gaps. What they did was choose each other, every day, in small and unglamorous ways. He built a ramp. She bought a coat. He made bad eggs. She stayed for dinner. He slammed a table in a courtroom and she cried in a parking garage, and they argued about coffee and thermostats and dogs. And through all of it, through the prank and the lawsuit and the public humiliation and the private fears that neither of them ever fully outgrew, they kept choosing to be in the same room. That's not a fairy tale. That's just love. The real kind. The kind that doesn't come with a soundtrack or a slow-motion kiss in the rain. The kind that shows up at 4 in the morning when the alarm goes off and you're tired and your back hurts and the coffee maker is broken, and you get up anyway because there's a kid down the hall who needs breakfast and a woman in the next room who needs the mug with the cartoon dog. The world wanted their story to be about the money. A broke construction worker and a billionaire in a wheelchair. That's the headline, the hook, the thing that makes people click. And maybe that's what it looked like from the outside. But from the inside, from the kitchen table with the wobbling leg and the paper plates and the science fair poster drying on the counter, it was never about the money. It was never about the chair. It was about 2 people who'd been told, by circumstance, by the people who left them, by the world that sorted them into categories and decided what they deserved, that they were not enough. And who met each other and thought, actually, maybe I'm wrong about that. Caleb still woke up early, not at 4:15 anymore, saw. The foreman hours were better, but early enough to have the kitchen to himself for a few minutes before the day started. He'd pour his coffee into the plain white mug. Vanessa had the dog one, and he'd accepted this loss with the quiet resignation of a man who knew which battles to surrender. And he'd stand at the window and look out at the street. The same street he'd looked at for years, the same houses, the same cracked driveways, The same tired neighborhood on the edge of a city that kept growing in every direction except this one. But the view was different now. Not because anything outside had changed, but because the window he was looking through had a wheelchair ramp visible at the bottom of the frame, and a 7-year-old's sneakers drying on the porch rail, and a laptop charger snaking across the counter, and all the evidence of a life that had more people in it than it used to. And every morning, every single one, there was a moment, right before Oliver came stumbling out of his room with Gerald under his arm, and Vanessa wheeled in demanding caffeine with the authority of a woman who commanded 400 employees, when Caleb stood alone in his kitchen and felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't happiness, exactly. Happiness was too clean a word for it, too finished. It was more like relief. The deep, aching, bone-level relief of a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that he'd forgotten the weight was there until someone finally helped him set it down. He stood there every morning and he felt it. And then Oliver appeared and Vanessa appeared and the day began, and the feeling didn't go away. It stayed. It settled into the house like warmth settling into walls. Not perfect, not permanent maybe, because nothing is, and Caleb had learned the hard way that promises mean less than presents. But real. Flawed and messy and inconvenient and occasionally infuriating, but real. And sometimes, standing in that kitchen with the morning light on his face, and the sound of his son laughing in the other room, and the woman he loved arguing with an 8-year-old about whether Ankylosaurus or Pachycephalosaurus would better survive downtown traffic, Caleb would catch himself doing something he'd forgotten he was capable of. Smiling. Before sunrise. For no reason at all except that the people who made his life feel whole were awake and near, and not going anywhere,